Chapter 11, Race and Ethnicity. I want to begin by giving you a definition of what a racial group is. It is a socially defined group distinguished by selected inherited physical characteristics such as skin color, hair texture, eye shape. Ethnicity is a broader definition. The word ethnic is derived from the Greek word ethnikos, which translates to nations in English. The word initially was applied to European immigrants, such as the Italians, Germans, Poles, and other national groups who came to the United States in large numbers, especially between 1900 and 1925. Today, ethnicity has a wider definition and may also refer to group membership based on religion, language, or region. So Jews, Mormons, even white Southerners can be considered to be an ethnic group. So ethnicity is based on cultural traits that reflect national origin, religion, and language. And here is a list of some racial and ethnic categories in the United States as of 2011. A minority is a group that is subordinate to the majority in terms of power and privilege. Such groups are usually, but not always, smaller than the dominant group. For example, class women are a numerical majority in America. There's more females than there are males, but yet they do have a minority status because it kind of goes back to what the definition of a minority group is, and that is they just don't have the power and the privilege. One of the most serious problems faced by racial and most ethnic groups in America does concern how they are perceived by others. A prejudice is a preconceived judgment, either good or bad, about another group. The development of prejudice is attributed to the social environment. It is not innate or biological. In other words, you are not born to be prejudiced. It is sustained through stereotypes, which are widely held beliefs about the character and the behavior of all members of a group. Now, stereotyping can be very harmful. In one way, they are often based on inaccurate information. They're used to justify discrimination against members of various ethnic and racial groups, and it can contribute to the development of an inferior self-concept. Stereotype predictions about behavior can certainly influence behavior in such a way that the predictions are going to come true, and Robert Merton referred to this as the self-fulfilling prophecy. While prejudice is a judgment or an attitude, discrimination is the overt behavior or the actions. There's a big difference between prejudice and discrimination. Racism is discrimination based on racial characteristics, and it does have three major components. One, it is the belief that one's own race is superior to others. It has an ideology or a set of beliefs that justifies the subjugation and exploitation of another group, and the beliefs are acted upon. And of course, once you act on those beliefs, then it does become discrimination. There are several ideologies or ideological tendencies that have played an important role in intergroup relations in the United States. One is called pluralism or cultural pluralism. This is the belief that culturally distinct groups can retain their communities and much of their culture even though they participate in the institutions of the larger society. To give an example, class, if you've ever been to any of the larger cities where you've got little Italys or Chinatowns or Spanish Harlems, it's showing where people are holding on to their culture yet participating in the larger institutions of society. And it's showing that it does work. We have a couple of terms here that you do need to be familiar with. Assimilation is where minorities gradually adopt patterns of the dominant culture. In other words, they're taking on the norms, the values, and the customs of the majority. And we have a concept called miscegenation, and this is the biological reproduction by partners of different racial categories. That is the one thing that sociologists looks at to see how much assimilating is taking place in the United States, and that is interracial marriages. Looking at some extreme forms of segregation or racism, I guess is the best thing to say. Genocide and mass expulsion is the two most extreme forms of racism. Genocide is the practice of deliberately destroying a whole race or ethnic group, such as what happened in Europe with the Holocaust in Germany. Mass expulsion is a practice of expelling groups or racial or ethnic groups from their homeland. The best example I can give you here is the Trail of Tears with the American Indian. Segregation is the ecological and institutional separation of races or ethnic groups. And then, like I stated earlier, assimilation is taking on the norms and values and customs of the majority. So as we go across the board, so to speak, we are becoming more tolerant. Now, I want to spend just a few minutes on segregation. Segregation can be voluntary or it can be involuntary. And of course, when I say voluntary, I'm talking about the desire of the people to live separate. For example, the Amish community in the United States voluntarily chooses to segregate themselves. We have two different forms of involuntary segregation. De jure segregation is created by laws that force people to be separate from others, and de facto segregation is created by unwritten norms that result in segregation, just as if it were legally required. The system that enforced segregation was supported by the Jim Crow laws, and of course de jure segregation was very common before the civil rights movement of the 1960s, especially in the South. The Jim Crow laws were in effect for about 100 years. It was just after the Civil War until the early 1970s. And during this time, of course, there was a color line that was applied that told blacks where they could live and go to school and so forth and so on. Now, class, this fell under the Plessis versus Ferguson 1896 separate but equal doctrine. It was set forth by the Supreme Court, and under this doctrine, separate facilities for people of different races were considered to be legal as long as they were of equal equality. But of course, we know that it wasn't. And in Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, this was a Supreme Court ruling that separate but equal was inherently unequal. And the Brown ruling put an end to legally segregated schools, hospitals, public accommodations. And then it took the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that mandated an end to segregation in our private accommodations. It made discrimination in the sale of housing illegal, and they initiated a major attack on the job ceiling through the strategy known as affirmative action.